So I've been gone a while. Each of these devlogs was supposed to be like 2 or 3 weeks of work, and this was very much not the case. I am currently refactoring the sprints to move almost all of the non-essential, non-necessary work like sound systems, animation systems, and modeling out of the next couple of sprints. Okay, so obviously this video took longer than it was supposed to, by about 6 months. If this happens again, the best way to support me in the meantime is by downloading my 2 mobile games, Poke My Balls and Launch My Dog. Poke My Balls was released like 6 years ago. It's okay, it's not the greatest game. And Launch My Dog was released a year and change ago. And I would say that is my opus for now. Launch My Dog is a much better game. It's a physics-based puzzle game where you shoot a hot dog into a hot dog bun. If you want to beat the whole thing, it only takes like 2 hours. Okay, so Castle Wars. More like I took some classes and a war started at Putin. I see you. For real though, I took 2 classes and they were each challenging enough that I put the project down. And because of that, this video takes place at 3 different times. I'm going to call those 3 times epochs, and the classes break up the epochs. So it's like Epoch 1, Class A, Epoch 2, Class B, and Epoch 3, which is now. Okay, I think I've rambled enough.
Yeah, shall we continue the music?
Well, that's weird. So Epoch 1 starts in late 2021, like December 18th or whenever I released the last devlog. I was really excited to keep working. School was out for break. I just started binging Gilmore Girls. The goal was to spend my work time and build out the second part of the Trifecta, which was weapons. And the Trifecta is the gameplay loop, weapons, movement, and abilities. So I created the sword class, which is basically a container for damage values, ranges, lunge distances, and attack frequencies. I modeled one of the worst swords I've seen in a while and made it a goofy little animation for swinging with no weight behind it. Can you tell I'm not an artist? I created all the UI for the sword, so there's 3 little indicators showing which attack you used and a little timer for when you're going to get the ability to attack back, and then a little blocking indication that also shows that you can't attack while you're blocking. I went online and I found a sound effect pack for melee combat, specifically sword melee combat, and I haven't used it yet. I did, however, add a sound for when you want to attack, you try and attack, and you're still waiting for the ability to attack to come back, and that sound is just shamelessly stolen from Half-Life. So we have a sword, now we need something to hit. So I took a capsule, slapped a little red texture, a name tag, and a health bar onto it, gave it a little bit of health, and boom, there's an enemy. Now, in order to give the enemies some place to hang out, I took down this wall, expanded the terrain, put a little water at the bottom, and created a few areas for things to just be housed. And this area up at the top is where the enemies get to hang out and hopefully thrive in their little part of the zoo. So now we have a sword, we have something to hit. How do we hit it? Early on, I watched a devlog for Chivalry Medieval Warfare, where the developers talked about having the sword swing and then tracking the position of the sword object over time and interpolating what got hit by it, and then just doing damage proportional to what and where it got hit. And so I'm doing that in a way. There's a collider on the sword and it tracks what it hits and then just does damage to it. I'll make this a little more complex later down the line, but for now it exists. I also added lunging because the energy sword in Halo has lunging, and that's sort of what I'm basing all of this off of, so I wanted to have it. And the way that this works is there's a trigger in front of the player camera and it tracks what enemies are within lunge range. Then when you start to attack, it checks line of sight. So are you directly looking at something to attack? And if not, it'll just go to the nearest enemy, and if there's nothing in the trigger, then it just doesn't lunge. And then Christmas happened. My brother got an Oculus Quest 2. I stole it for a few days to play Half-Life Alyx, and I got so inspired by the holographic UI and the loading screen city element that I wanted to make holographic swords, and this pushed me to start designing swords onto iPad. And even though they're not in the game yet, the goal is to have 6 or so different sword types and then various different forms of these swords, and then I can keep adding more and more forms, and they're not going to affect gameplay at all. It's just going to be cosmetic, meaning I could use that as a monetization route, but I'm probably not going to. Okay, so also in the last devlog, I mentioned that I was strictly making a melee combat game because Destiny 2's gun combat is just buttery smooth and it feels good to just use the weapons. Well, I can't compete with that, so I'm gonna make a melee combat game. And Bungie added a melee combat weapon and it's first person and it feels like butter. I would like to remind Bungie though that I have swimming in my game and I have ladders. Who's really winning? Also, if a Destiny 2 developer wants to come and make the glaive in Unity for free, that would be great. So this is Epoch 2, and the class I took that splits up Epoch 1 and Epoch 2 was called Analysis of Algorithms, and the first half was focusing mostly on efficiency of algorithms, and the second was a deep dive into the graph data structure. The graph data structure is very useful for things like navigation and search, AI, ordering complex problems, and all of that is important. But the takeaway that I had is a couple weeks before the class ended, I realized that graphs were how you navigate a menu using a controller. All of these nodes on this graph are the buttons or the UI elements, and you traverse them by moving your stick or your D-pad or whatever, and it just goes through an edge, and you just store whatever active node you're on. I came out of this class, and it was a hard class, so I was very burnt out, and burnt out Frank figured, well, I have a week. It's spring break. How hard could controller input be? It was hard. So I added controller input to the input actions asset, which basically just allowed me to move and do all the basic character stuff from a controller, with the exception of sprinting being as it maybe should. You'd have to hold down the stick, which is annoying. So that got put on the back burner. I still haven't implemented it. Then I made a node class. I made a graph class, and the graph is basically just a list of nodes and then whatever one you start on, and a little like event for whatever we want to do when you hit the back button on a controller, because the affirmative one is going to do whatever the node tells it to do, and back is going to be for the whole graph. Each node just contains a list of the nodes it can traverse to and on what buttons, as well as what to do when you hit A or whatever your affirm button is. So the one hiccup I had was with the PlayStation controller. Now I have a PlayStation controller that it works fine. The sticks are a little worn out. I think it's an issue with Unity itself, but basically you'd have like holding down the right trigger be the left and right axis of a stick. I think it's direct input and not X input, and that is the problem, but I don't know. I'm assuming it's a problem with Unity's input system and not a problem that I created, or at least I hope. It doesn't make sense. I want to destroy my PlayStation controller because of it. Put that also on the back burner. Hopefully Unity fixes their shit at some point. I just took the rest of that day and I made a little component that stores all the icons for the UI, and then just made it update all of the icons depending on if you're on a controller or a keyboard or a PlayStation controller or whatever. And then I added a little visor to the player, which I think is cute. It gives it a little more personality. It's not leveled, it's not on axis, and it looks right out of Among Us. Plus, it goes up and down when you crouch. Plenty of personality for a minimum viable product. It was, at that point, Friday or Saturday of spring break. I was running out of days. I hastily added a pause menu that didn't really play nice with dying while you were in it. So like if you fell into a kill plane while the pause menu was open, or swapping between a controller and the keyboard and mouse. And there were a lot of issues with that, a lot of bugs. I had to put the game down because I knew what class I was about to take, and I knew that I was not gonna have time to continue the project, at least for a month or so. 2 months, 3 months. I'm a computer science student, which means I have crippling imposter syndrome. But it also means that I'm actively taking classes that make me a better programmer. And if you recall, that's one of the goals of this project. Now, unfortunately, the way that manifests is that I will work on the project, week or two into a quarter, I'll be like, oh fuck, classes are hard. I'm learning stuff. I put the project down, I wait like 2 months, and then at the end of the 2 months, I'm like, oh yeah, the thing I was working on, I should continue working on that. And I come back to it and I look at all the code that I wrote before the class and I'm like, this is garbage. Now that's fine. It means I'm growing as a person and as a programmer, and my skills have improved. But it also means that the perceived level of progress is very, very slow, because I'm not like building up. I'm more giving myself the ability to build higher. So the class I took this past spring is commonly known as one of the hardest programming classes at my university, and that is computer systems. It covers high-level concepts like modularity and stuff to handle incommensurate scaling, server-client protocols, different system architectures, virtualization, which encompasses multiplexing, aggregation, and emulation, and then lastly, multi-threading. So how do you split up work over multiple threads so that it can happen in parallel and faster, as well as all of the just complete and utter bullshit that comes with splitting up tasks, like synchronization, the fact that you can have multiple things writing to the same critical region at the same time, or busy waiting when something is not doing anything but doing a lot at the same time. And then those were the high-level concepts we were learning, and we had to apply them by writing an HTTP server, a multi-threaded HTTP server in C. So we're taking all these high-level concepts and making a low-level product out of it. And this taught me a few things, because the assignment was split up into checkpoints. It quickly taught me how to handle revisions. You have to back up and build up. You refactor the foundation so that it can accomplish this new goal. That's A. B, I learned that I could optimize the fuck out of Castle Wars. It was so complex because I was just building a system and then being like, oh, I need another system, build another system, without ever thinking about how they interconnect, or can interconnect, or can be generalized. I knew I wanted to improve the foundation of Castle Wars before I continued. So I spent a few days, debated restarting the project entirely. I debated just stopping because it seemed like a lot to rewrite. I debated swapping to Unreal. A lot of big games are made in Unreal. I don't know a lot of big games that are made in Unity. A couple days into this mini existential crisis, I saw a video called "Watch This Before Working on a Big Game in Unity," and I watched it. And it assured me that it was possible to at least build a big game in Unity. It pointed out that a lot of the Unity devlogs that you see, the ones that are fun and entertaining to watch, aren't necessarily about big games. And the ones that are, or at least try to be a big game, end up fizzling out or just canceling the project because it gets too complex and too out of scope too quickly. I knew that I had to get the complexity of Castle Wars down really fast to something manageable before I could continue.
Elegance in the form of a black elephant, smoking white wine, no on terraces.
Here is a design diagram, and it's scary. Trust me, it's scary. It makes a lot of sense to me. It looks a little bit like the layout of a computer chip, or at least it feels this way. It allows me to have multiple local players on different controller types. It also allows me to have either a local server or a remote server, and it determines how input is going to work, how the players are going to interact with a game manager and then a server, and it eliminates a lot of issues, specifically crosstalk. So this design allows me to abstract systems into modules, and then unless I'm actively working on that module, I can just worry about what goes into that module and what comes out of it. Usually I'm working on a different module that only interacts with one side. The input mapping layer goes into a bunch of input bootstrappers, which then sends input either to the player or to the UI. Each one of those steps, you don't have to worry about the previous or the next step, you just have to worry about that step. This also means that I can probably reuse a lot of the design and the code here in future projects. I want you to pay attention to two areas, specifically this area in the top left, which is all about input, and this big old bridge on the middle right of the image, where the game client interacts with a game manager, which interacts with the server. And the reason I want you to pay attention to these is that is where I spent most of my time. So let's focus on the player, manager, and server model first. I realized pretty quickly that I needed to rip apart a lot of the players' systems in order for them to be duplicated and allow for split screen. This is how I played Castle Wars growing up. I wanted to build it into the game so that more people can have that experience. When I said crosstalk earlier, it was mentioning the fact that a lot of the players' systems needed to find other components in Unity regarding the player to function. And so when you have multiple players, P1 can find player 2's controller. So the player prefab now contains the player input component and a bootstrapper, as well as the actual controller prefab and the UI. And all the component references are now settled because they're all contained into this one prefab. So there's absolutely no need to find any, and that eliminates all of the crosstalk. I also combined the three UIs into one, so the HUD, the death menu, and the pause menu are now one menu that changes state depending on the state of the player. So the game manager, it holds an array of local players as well as references to a lot of common things that it might might need to access. The game manager sets camera properties whenever cameras are spawned in. That splits the screen for split screen and also orders the cameras correctly because there's multiple levels of rendering. A quick aside on that, so there's 4 render layers. The bottom is the world and third-person weapon models, like other players' third-person weapon models. Then the character's first-person weapon, and then world space UI like a name tag, and then camera space UI, so like your HUD. And the game manager keeps track of all the weapon models and the name tags that need to get rendered or readjusted per player. That way they can be rendered per player. Lastly, the game manager takes any server calls that the player might have and directs them. So that way the game manager knows if it's a local or a remote server and sends it accordingly. The last component of this 3-part system is the server. Now the server handles global game settings, respawn times, per team, player prefabs, where the death cameras are. So the server can keep track of respawn times and basically do any sort of validation there. Ideally, it will also do hit validation. The next sprint is going to be on networking. So there's going to be a lot more server stuff in there. Now, the other section I drew your attention to was this input section. And you'll see that we have input controllers, a mapping layer, and then a bunch of input thingies. The problem was that if you hit the A button to jump on one controller and you had 4 players, because each player didn't know what devices it had, it would jump on all of them. I set up this screen where you could set devices to each player. And then if the A button was detected, we would then check, was that A button pressed on my controller? And so the way that this works is there's the player input component in the player prefab. It detects when the inputs on the controllers are given, and then it triggers events in the bootstrapper, which then send the input to either the UI or the player. I now had working split screen. Then I fully implemented the pause menu from Epoch 2, and I started writing this video.
Yeah, they make you get up. Love buckles under the strain.
So these devlogs are likely going to get more and more complex. This is going to be a huge project. It's the largest, at least, that I've undertaken. As I mentioned earlier, there aren't very many large game devlogs, or at least of finished games by 1 or 2 people. Satisfactory has a very good devlog, but it's from a team. So I figured maybe I could do that. If I could figure out how to do this stuff, at least well enough to sort of explain it in a video, then I would at least have a way of combating imposter syndrome, and at best have a resource that people can look to when they want to make a large game. They can see what not to do. They can see all of the mistakes I've made. You got to give someone the expectation that making a game is fun. It's not just map design, character design, animating, and sounds. I love the art stuff. I still want to show it all, but game development isn't just building the world. It's this ever-growing task that can get out of hand and overwhelm you if you don't stop every once in a while and take a step back to plan where you're still going. You've made it this far in the video, you know all the YouTube stuff, engage it, subscribe, like it. I don't really care as long as you keep watching and maybe you get the game when it's out. I made a mailing list and a TikTok. If you want to support me, again, the best way to do that is to download my 2 mobile games, Launch My Dog and Pokemon Balls.